I've never told this story publicly before, and even writing it now makes my stomach tighten a little. For context, my name is William. I'm in my 40s now, and most people who know me today would never guess that a large part of my life was spent making terrible decisions and convincing myself they weren't as bad as they really were. This happened about 15 years ago, when I was working as an administrative assistant for a small property management company. The pay was mediocre, I was drowning in debt, and every month felt like a race against overdue notices and collection calls. I wasn't desperate enough to rob a bank, but I was desperate enough to start noticing opportunities that an honest person would ignore. The opportunity came in the form of paperwork. One afternoon, while sorting lease agreements and ownership records, I noticed something that most people probably wouldn't have paid attention to. Several important transactions required 2 signatures on the same document before money could be released. One signature belonged to the property owner, and the other belonged to a business partner or co-owner. The process looked secure on paper, but in reality it relied heavily on trust. Nobody expected the signatures to be questioned. Nobody expected someone inside the office to look too closely. That realization stayed with me. At first it was just a passing thought. Then it became a possibility. Then, before I fully admitted it to myself, it became a plan. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one night, staring at unpaid bills spread across my kitchen table. The numbers didn't add up. No matter how carefully I budgeted, I was sinking deeper every month. And that was the night I first considered creating what I would later call the double signature. One document. 2 different people. Only one of them would actually sign it. The other signature would come from me. Looking back, I wish I could say I immediately rejected the idea. I wish I could say my conscience won. Instead, I started wondering whether I could pull it off. And once that question entered my mind, everything began moving in a very dangerous direction. I wish I could tell you there was one dramatic moment when I decided to cross the line, but that's not how it happened. It was slower than that. The thought settled into my head and refused to leave. I'd go to work, answer emails, organize files, smile at coworkers, and all the while that single idea would keep circling back. What if nobody noticed? The worst part is how quickly I found ways to justify it. I told myself the company made plenty of money. I told myself I wasn't hurting anyone directly. I even convinced myself I'd only do it once, solve my financial problems, and spend the rest of my life making better choices. That lie was the easiest one to believe. Over the next couple of weeks, I paid closer attention to how documents moved through the office. I noticed habits, routines, and little moments everyone else ignored. I wasn't looking at them like an employee anymore. I was looking at them as someone searching for an opportunity. That realization scared me more than anything. Because it meant I had already started changing, long before I'd actually done anything. By that point, the hardest battle wasn't with anyone else, it was with myself. Every morning I'd tell myself I was done thinking about it. Every evening I'd catch my mind wandering back to the same idea. I wasn't sleeping well, and I started snapping at people over nothing. It felt like I was carrying around a secret that didn't even exist yet. What finally pushed me wasn't a single catastrophe. It was the accumulation of small failures. My landlord reminded me that I was behind on rent. My credit card was maxed out. My car needed repairs I couldn't afford. Everywhere I looked, there was another problem demanding money I didn't have. Instead of asking for help, I let my pride make decisions for me. I remember sitting alone one weekend, staring at a stack of ordinary office forms I'd brought home by accident. They were completely harmless, but seeing them on my kitchen table made everything feel more real. Work had stopped being just work. In my mind, it had become the place where I believed I could fix my life. That was the moment I crossed the line, not with my actions, but with my thinking. Once I accepted that I was capable of doing it, turning back became harder than I ever expected. Once I'd admitted to myself that I was seriously considering it, everything around me seemed different. The office hadn't changed, but I had. Conversations that used to sound ordinary faded into the background because my mind was always somewhere else. I'd catch myself staring out the window, replaying imaginary scenarios and wondering how my life had reached this point. The strange thing is that no one suspected anything. My coworkers still joked with me in the break room. My manager trusted me with routine paperwork because I'd earned a reputation for being organized and dependable. Every compliment made me feel worse. They were describing the man I used to be, not the one I was becoming. Days turned into weeks, and I kept waiting for a reason to abandon the whole idea. I wanted something, a promotion, an unexpected check, even a lucky break, to convince me I didn't need to go through with it. Nothing came. Instead, I found myself quietly hoping for an opportunity that would make the choice feel inevitable. Looking back, that's what frightens me most. I wasn't forced into a corner. I slowly convinced myself that crossing the line was the only way forward, even though deep down I knew it never really was. The opportunity appeared on a Tuesday, almost insultingly ordinary. There was nothing dramatic about it. Phones were ringing, people were complaining about printers, someone had brought donuts into the break room. It looked like every other workday I'd had there. Then a file landed on my desk. It involved a property transaction that had been delayed because one of the required approvals hadn't been finalized. Everyone seemed mildly annoyed by the paperwork, but no one treated it like a priority. My manager simply said we'd deal with it later in the week and hurried off to another meeting. I remember looking at that folder longer than I should have. My pulse picked up, and I had to force myself to look away before anyone noticed. It felt as if the room had suddenly become too quiet, even though people were still talking all around me. For the rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept finding excuses to glance toward the stack of documents waiting to be processed. Every time I did, I heard two competing voices in my head. One told me to forget it and go home. The other whispered that this might be the only chance I'd ever get. By the time I locked my computer that evening, I knew the real decision wasn't whether to act. It was whether I still had the courage to walk away. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd picture two different versions of my future. In one, I walked into work, ignored the opportunity, and kept struggling through life the honest way. In the other, I crossed a line I could never uncross. Strangely, the second future seemed easier, at least in the short term. When I got to the office the next morning, everything felt painfully normal. People chatted about weekend plans, someone complained about the coffee machine, and my manager rushed past without a second glance. I remember thinking how bizarre it was that the biggest decision of my life was unfolding in a place that looked so ordinary. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I kept asking myself if I was really the kind of person who would betray the trust people had placed in me. I'd always thought criminals were fundamentally different from everyone else. Now I realized the line wasn't nearly as clear as I'd believed. It wasn't crossed in a single leap. It was crossed one compromise at a time. By lunchtime, I'd stopped asking whether I could do it. The only question left was whether I was prepared to live with whatever happened afterward. That afternoon, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I remember staring at the office clock, convinced everyone could hear how hard my heart was beating. It sounds dramatic now, but that's exactly how it felt. I wasn't thinking like an employee anymore. I was thinking like someone about to betray every bit of trust he'd earned. When the paperwork finally came back to my desk, my hands were unsteady. I paused more than once, hoping something would interrupt me. A phone call, a coworker asking for help, even a fire drill. Nothing happened. The silence was almost an invitation. I made the choice I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. The second I committed to it, I knew there was no undoing it. Whether anyone ever discovered the truth no longer mattered in that instant. I had already become the person I'd promised myself I would never be. I expected to feel relief, maybe even excitement. Instead, I felt hollow. The rest of the workday blurred together. I answered questions, exchanged small talk, and even laughed at someone's joke. On the outside, I looked exactly the same. Inside, I was waiting for someone to point at me and say, "We know." No one did. That was somehow even more unsettling than being confronted. I expected everything to fall apart the very next day. I walked into the office convinced I'd be called into my manager's office before I even had time to set my bag down. Every unfamiliar expression on a coworker's face felt like evidence that they'd figured it out. But the day passed. Then another. Nothing happened. That silence became its own kind of punishment. Instead of feeling safe, I became obsessed with the idea that someone, somewhere, was about to connect the dots. Every email notification made my pulse jump. Every unexpected phone call felt like the beginning of the end. The strange thing was that everyone treated me exactly as they always had. My manager thanked me for staying on top of paperwork. A coworker even joked that I was the most reliable person in the office. I forced a smile, but hearing those words made me feel sick. At home, I stopped enjoying the things that usually helped me unwind. Movies, books, even meeting friends for dinner all felt pointless because my mind kept replaying the same question: how long until someone notices? For the first time, I understood that getting away with something doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like serving a sentence that no one else can see. About 2 weeks later, the calm finally cracked. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. No one burst into the office demanding answers. Instead, little questions started appearing. Someone from accounting asked whether a file had been updated correctly. My manager mentioned that a document would need to be reviewed because of a minor inconsistency. Neither conversation was directly about me, but hearing them made my stomach drop. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, though I doubt I fooled myself. Every casual discussion sounded like an interrogation. Every glance in my direction felt loaded with suspicion, even when people were probably thinking about something completely unrelated. The worst part was realizing how paranoia changes you. I started over-explaining simple things. I volunteered information no one had asked for. Looking back, I was drawing more attention to myself by trying so hard to appear relaxed. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying every conversation from the past few days. I kept wondering whether I'd missed some obvious sign that the truth was closing in. For the first time since it all began, I admitted something I hadn't wanted to face. Even if no one ever proved what I'd done, I wasn't the same person anymore. The guilt had become impossible to leave behind. I didn't get exposed because someone was a brilliant investigator. I got exposed because the truth has a way of surfacing when enough people start asking ordinary questions. A routine internal review turned into a series of uncomfortable meetings. At first, management believed the paperwork issue was nothing more than an administrative mistake. They asked employees to explain who had handled different files and when. My name came up naturally because I'd worked with the documents. When my manager invited me into his office, he didn't look angry. He looked confused. That somehow made it worse. He asked me to walk him through the timeline, and I answered as calmly as I could. Most of what I said was technically true, but I carefully avoided the parts that mattered most. The more I talked, the more exhausted I felt. Keeping the story straight required far more energy than simply telling the truth ever would have. Then he placed a document on the desk between us. He didn't accuse me. He simply asked, "Can you help me understand why this doesn't make sense?" I looked at the page and realized the moment I'd feared for weeks had finally arrived. For the first time since it all began, I had no convincing answer left. I wish I could say I held on until the very end, but I didn't. Sitting across from my manager, looking at that document, I felt something inside me give way. I was exhausted, not from work, but from carrying weeks of fear, guilt, and constant anxiety. There was a long silence between us. He kept waiting for an explanation, and I kept searching for one that would somehow make me look less selfish than I really was. Nothing came. Every excuse I had rehearsed suddenly sounded pathetic. My debt wasn't anyone else's responsibility. My frustration with life didn't erase the choices I'd made. So I stopped talking in circles. I admitted that I'd betrayed the trust people had placed in me. I didn't dress it up or blame anyone else. Saying the words out loud was strangely relieving, even though I knew they would cost me my job and probably much more. My manager didn't yell. He just looked disappointed. I'd expected anger. I could have handled anger. Disappointment was harder. It forced me to see myself through someone else's eyes, a person they had believed was dependable, now sitting in front of them admitting he had destroyed the trust for reasons that no longer sounded convincing. Even to himself, everything moved surprisingly fast after that. Once I'd admitted what I'd done, the process no longer belonged to me. I was suspended from work almost immediately, and over the following weeks I had to answer difficult questions from people I'd respected for years. Some were angry, some were simply confused, and a few couldn't even look me in the eye. Losing my job was only part of the punishment. The harder part was going home every day knowing I created this situation myself. There was no one left to blame, not my debts, not bad luck, not the company. Every consequence traced back to a decision I'd made. My family eventually found out. That conversation was worse than any meeting at work. Hearing the disappointment in their voices hurt more than anything that happened professionally. They didn't ask why I'd needed money. They wanted to know why I hadn't trusted them enough to ask for help instead. That question stayed with me. I realized I'd spent weeks convincing myself I had no other choice, when in reality I'd refused to consider the choices that required humility. Pride had pushed me toward a decision that solved nothing and cost me far more than I ever imagined. The months that followed were quieter than I'd expected. There were no dramatic movie scenes, no sudden redemption, and certainly no overnight second chances. Life simply became smaller. I had to accept temporary jobs, live on a tight budget, and rebuild a routine that no longer included the career I'd thrown away. I wish I could say I held on until the very end, but I didn't. Sitting across from my manager, looking at that document, I felt something inside me give way. I was exhausted, not from work, but from carrying weeks of fear, guilt, and constant anxiety. There was a long silence between us. He kept waiting for an explanation, and I kept searching for one that would somehow make me look less selfish than I really was. Nothing came. Every excuse I had rehearsed suddenly sounded pathetic. My debt wasn't anyone else's responsibility. My frustration with life didn't erase the choices I'd made. So I stopped talking in circles. I admitted that I'd betrayed the trust people had placed in me. I didn't dress it up or blame anyone else. Saying the words out loud was strangely relieving, even though I knew they would cost me my job and probably much more. My manager didn't yell. He just looked disappointed. I'd expected anger. I could have handled anger. Disappointment was harder. It forced me to see myself through someone else's eyes, a person they had believed was dependable, now sitting in front of them admitting he had destroyed the trust for reasons that no longer sounded convincing. Even to himself, everything moved surprisingly fast after that. Once I'd admitted what I'd done, the process no longer belonged to me. I was suspended from work almost immediately, and over the following weeks I had to answer difficult questions from people I'd respected for years. Some were angry, some were simply confused, and a few couldn't even look me in the eye. Losing my job was only part of the punishment. The harder part was going home every day knowing I created this situation myself. There was no one left to blame, not my debts, not bad luck, not the company. Every consequence traced back to a decision I'd made. My family eventually found out. That conversation was worse than any meeting at work. Hearing the disappointment in their voices hurt more than anything that happened professionally. They didn't ask why I'd needed money. They wanted to know why I hadn't trusted them enough to ask for help instead. That question stayed with me. I realized I'd spent weeks convincing myself I had no other choice, when in reality I'd refused to consider the choices that required humility. Pride had pushed me toward a decision that solved nothing and cost me far more than I ever imagined. The months that followed were quieter than I'd expected. There were no dramatic movie scenes, no sudden redemption, and certainly no overnight second chances. Life simply became smaller. I had to accept temporary jobs, live on a tight budget, and rebuild a routine that no longer included the career I'd thrown away. What surprised me most was how difficult it was to regain my own respect. Other people eventually moved on with their lives, but I carried the memory everywhere. Every job interview reminded me of the question I dreaded most: why did you leave your previous position? Even when I answered honestly, I could see people trying to decide whether I deserved another opportunity. Some said everyone makes mistakes. They're right. But not every mistake follows you for years. The experience forced me to rethink what integrity actually means. I'd always believed honesty was something you either had or didn't have. Now I see it differently. Integrity is a series of choices made every single day, especially when no one is watching. I failed that test once, and the consequences taught me just how expensive a single decision can become. It's been years now, and on most days my life looks completely ordinary. I have steady work again, I pay my bills on time, and I try not to take trust for granted. From the outside, you'd never know there was a chapter like this buried in my past. But I know. Every so often, I'll be asked to sign a document at a bank, a doctor's office, or when starting a new job. It's such a simple act, just writing my name, but it always brings me back to that time. A signature isn't just ink on paper. It's a promise that the person behind it is being truthful. I learned that lesson by violating it. People sometimes imagine guilt fades with time. In my experience, it changes instead. The panic eventually disappears, but the memory settles into something quieter. It becomes a reminder of who you were and who you're trying to be now. I can't erase what I did, and I don't expect sympathy for it. All I can do is make sure that one terrible decision doesn't define every decision that comes after it. That's the only kind of redemption I believe in anymore. If you've read this far, you're probably expecting me to end with some dramatic revelation or a clever excuse for everything that happened. There isn't one. I committed a crime because I convinced myself that my problems made me an exception to the rules. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that no one would really be hurt, and that I'd fix everything afterward. Those lies felt reasonable at the time. Looking back, they're painfully transparent. What I learned is that bad decisions rarely arrive wearing a warning label. They usually begin as small compromises that seem harmless on their own. You tell yourself you'll only bend your principles once, and before you realize it, you've become someone you no longer recognize. If you're struggling financially or emotionally, don't isolate yourself the way I did. Talk to someone you trust. Ask for help, even if it feels embarrassing. Pride is a terrible advisor, and silence has a way of making desperate ideas seem logical. I can't change what I did, and I don't expect forgiveness from strangers. What I can do is tell the truth about where my choices led me. If this story keeps even one person from making the same mistake, then at least something worthwhile has come from one of the worst chapters of my life.